This is Lou Elizondo, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined on today's show by an author, lecturer, researcher, and truly one of the prominent speakers of the last few decades in the UFO conversation. It is my privilege to welcome Mr. Richard Dolan to the podcast. Richard, welcome.
Andy, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very excited for this one. And Richard, I almost hate to ask you this question given how well I know you and your work and what you've done for many years, but there's a lot of new listeners and viewers who have come into the UFO conversation in the last weeks and months, given how much coverage it's had, especially in the United States. And if someone newer to this topic is hearing and seeing you for the first time, how would you describe your part in the UFO conversation?
That's a totally fair question. I've been studying UFOs for about 30 years. I've been public as an author, I guess, for a little more than 20 years. But I got into this in the 1990s originally. I was back in those days working on a PhD in United States diplomatic history, Cold War strategy, things like that. And I fell into the UFO subject. I saw a UFO book, actually by UK author Timothy Good, called Above Top Secret, The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. There's a title to catch your attention when you're browsing through a bookstore. And I thought, wow, Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. Even in the 90s, people knew that there were claims of a UFO cover-up, of course. And, I was studying the administration of President Harry Truman in the 1940s. And so there was a lot of overlap there in terms of what was discussed. I mean, I knew back then that there was this talk about Roswell in the 1940s. So what was that about? So I looked through Tim's book, and the strange thing back then was that I recognized a number of names that I had studied in my academic world. And here he was putting them in this UFO book. And I thought, well, I've never made that connection to UFOs in my academic work. What's going on here? He had a bunch of documents that looked like they might be legitimate. And I kept reading, and I bought the book, and really, all that I wanted to do to start out was simply resolve one question, which was, is this a thing? Is there anything to these claims that there was a UFO something and that there was a cover-up? Because I was studying that exact period of time where this allegedly happened. And in my own life, I just did not want to have this big question mark hanging over my head. Like, is this a thing or is this not a thing? So I thought I would just take a month or two or maybe 3 months tops out of my life to resolve that issue. That was 30 years ago. I'm still doing it. What I determined pretty early on, frankly, was that, oh, yes, there absolutely was, no question, a significant UFO problem for national security people, particularly the United States, which is what I started out studying. Eventually started looking at other nations as well. But within the U.S., it became obvious that the U.S. military was encountering these things that did not make sense. And we knew this because starting in the late 1970s, the United States passed what was called the Freedom of Information Act, or actually they strengthened the Freedom of Information Act in the 70s. And that allowed for the release of many UFO-related documents. And so you could just read them. Some of them aren't all that incredible, but some really are. And they describe, in many cases, just violations of sensitive airspace by objects described as disc-shaped, with incredible capabilities and maneuverabilities and speeds and evasiveness. And when you start reading, if you read one or two or three, you might think, okay, someone might be misinterpreting this or that. But you start reading dozens and then hundreds, and you start to think this is actually a real phenomenon. Who is behind it? And one question simply led to a dozen more. So I thought, well, who's behind it? And you read the old documents and you see analysts in the 1940s and 1950s asked the exact same questions that we ask today. Is this the Russians? Is this a secret American project? Is this something else? So that just took me down a series of rabbit holes that I have never, ever left. So what I'm a historian of the UFO subject. I study the sightings, I study the politics, and I study the, I guess you could say, the development of ufology itself. That is the study of this. Like where were we in the 1950s? Where were we in the 60s and 70s? And where are we today? That's of great interest to me. So it's really the entire subject gets me very interested. The sightings and the politics are probably the two biggest things, the cover-up. So that's where I've been. And sometimes it gets me labeled as a conspiracy theorist, something you're not supposed to believe in these days. But, well, I don't mind. The world does have conspiracies, and the UFO cover-up is very likely the greatest of them all.
I can't disagree with that. And you say that one question leads to a dozen more. Do you feel at this point in your research that you've got more answers than questions, or do you still feel there's an exponential list of questions?
That's an awesome question. I have more answers than I used to have, that is for sure, but there's a lot of questions that keep popping up, and I have no doubt that there are some questions I'll never have a true answer to. But I've answered a number of questions for myself, absolutely. My very, very first question I answered quickly, which was this an actual topic of interest to U.S. national security high-level people? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. That was a significant concern to them. And as far as I could see, it never stopped being a concern to them. It has always been one. So, but a lot of other questions have been raised and sometimes answered. I asked the question: Are these from here or not from here? Are they from our civilization or are they not from our civilization? That's obviously a fundamental question, and I think the answer to that is yes to both. They are, some of them are, in my opinion, are definitely not from our civilization as we understand it. But I think some probably are, yeah. So I think that we've developed covertly some capability to do some level of replication of exotic technology. I don't think that we've got the ability truly to duplicate what these other beings, and I think they are other beings, what they can do, but I think we have a significant covert world. Sometimes I've called it a breakaway civilization that does exist and that does work very, very hard to understand this exotic tech and science and probably to catch up to these other beings in whatever way they can. I think it's a secret, almost like a secret Cold War that's going on there.
There are a lot of different ways I wanted to take this interview, so I hope this is one of many, Richard. So hopefully it goes well enough you come back, and I said that to you before we hit record. So I'm going to take you back as far as December 2017. Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Kean, Helene Cooper penned the article in the New York Times, which opens the door to where we are now, and it's been a whirlwind almost 6 years as we record this. But how did we get to that point? Because there were articles in newspapers and magazines and websites many times over before that. Why did this one hit so big, so hard, and not only kick open the door, but leave the door open that sort of set off this chain reaction to where we are now?
I think researchers are still debating this and still trying to figure it out. Why? Why that? Well, one obvious answer to that is that you had Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, who are both respected journalists in the mainstream establishment press, who have both been sympathetic to UFOs for years. And Helene Cooper is not a UFO journalist. She's really a Defense Department. That's her beat, the U.S. Defense Department military. But she participated. But Leslie and Ralph are well known as sympathetic to the UFO, especially Leslie. And the fact that they got it published in the New York Times was a bombshell. Now, the real question is why did the New York Times allow those articles to go forward? They did 2 articles that day. And that's the question. I've developed my own theories about it. I think that it's correct. I'll just share you what I believe, which is that you have to go back to the formation of Tom DeLonge's organization, To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, TTSA, which he had been in the works for actually a couple of years. In 2017, he finally gets it going with their big press conference in just October, 2 months earlier than the article you mentioned. And many people are familiar with that, of course. That's where we got to see Lou Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, Hal Puthoff was there, Jim Semivan. And they, made some very, very bold statements. That press conference, there were some mistakes that they offered. The Mylar balloon as a UFO and all of that was a mistake. But really, they had a very big impact. And what became clear was that Lou Elizondo was someone who was quite important to all of this. And so I think if you're the New York Times, you realize this is a story that's not going to go away. So Leslie and Ralph, from what I have understood from them, and from some public statements they've made also, is that they just were able to persuade the New York Times that this is a story, it's legit, it's bona fide, and I suspect that the New York Times, which has always been hostile to UFOs, always, I think their leadership realized this is a story that's going to break. Let us get out in front of it. And if you notice, when you read those articles, they did a few things to minimize the impact of what was being said. This was known to me explicitly at the time. It's now much more widely acknowledged. But they brought in certain skeptical voices in those articles that were utterly meaningless to the article, but they just did that just to tamp down any enthusiasm people might have had. So actually, the New York Times piece could have been much stronger than it even was. But what I think you see, and what we have been seeing, to answer your question, is that we're seeing a battle of factions, I believe, within the national security leadership of the United States, which has always been the case relating to UFOs or pretty much anything. Ruling elites throughout history have always had factions. Caesar was a faction against Pompey 2,000 years ago. There are always competing groups. And within the UFO cover-up, this has long been understood that there have been groups that opposed the secrecy and that groups that supported the secrecy. And I think we're seeing a variation of that playing out today. I mean, there's much more we can say about it. But I think Christopher Mellon was very important in all of this. He was very well placed. He was able to arrange for TTSA to connect with Leslie and Ralph of the New York Times, and also got the article in Politico, which we often forget about, but that came out at the same time. So I think Chris Mellon is one of the key behind-the-scenes players in this. He was able to make it happen. And then the thing is, because the New York Times covered this story as openly as it did, as sympathetically as it did, that in a sense gave permission to the rest of the Western media establishment to look at this and to follow up, which frankly, most Western media did not, but some did. I think most notably in the United States, there was Tucker Carlson, who until recently over at Fox covered the UFO subject extremely well for a mainstream guy. He did an exceptional job. So I think it opened the door for some other voices to step in and to pick it up. So now it hasn't led to disclosure. It hasn't led to a statement by the president of the United States or some other national leader. But there has been, as you've noted, an uptick in the conversation. It's no longer the third rail of public discourse. You can talk about UFOs or UAP and not get ridiculed. It's a very different situation now. So that's a positive thing. We still have a long, long way to go before we have a genuinely adult-level conversation about this subject within the mainstream. I think we're not even close to there. But inch by inch, we're getting toward a better, more meaningful conversation about the subject. So we'll see where this leads.
I'll play devil's advocate for a moment and ask you, do you think in a way that the article didn't have the lasting impact we wanted? And what I mean by that is that since then, the New York Times has never followed up, or any other major news outlet, in the same big way. I think the closest we got was the rumoured crash retrieval article that then appeared to be heavily censored. It came out around a year and a half ago. And then the David Grush story, which appears to be the natural successor, the next point on this journey, was passed on, as we know, by the Washington Post and New York Times. We've heard due to time constraints and David Grush wanting the story out quicker than potentially those outlets would have wanted. Do you think that was the last big talking point? And could there have been more of a lasting impact? Or has there been a deliberate attempt to keep the story down by some of those factions in the background?
Yeah, I think you and I may be on the similar track here, actually. Because what I think has been going on is that, as you rightly point out, the New York Times did a little bit of follow-up after that initial 2 articles, but all of the positive follow-up was by Leslie and Ralph themselves. They did an article about a little over a year later, if you recall, in 2019. They did another very good article, actually, in the summer of 2020, where they came very close to getting an acknowledgement of actual genuine crash retrievals of UFOs. I mean, that was a statement by Eric Davis, Dr. Davis, that they got in there. So they did some, but you are right in that the New York Times, other than with Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, really did no meaningful follow-up whatsoever, nor did any of the other major establishment outlets. Washington Post, which is, in my view, really little more than a CIA outlet anyway. But you got the New York Times, you got the Post, you've got all of the major television networks, particularly, I'm thinking of the United States. The only outlet in the U.S. of a mainstream sort that followed up, as I mentioned before, was Fox with Tucker Carlson. And at Fox, it was only Tucker Carlson. There was really nobody else there. He was really the standalone voice. So I think if you're suggesting that the establishment was very reticent or even hostile to the story, I would say that's probably true. I think the establishment was not, we have to understand, how is our media set up? I mean, we don't have a free establishment media. It's obvious. Anyone who's done any kind of study of something like Operation Mockingbird way back during the Cold War, this was CIA explicit manipulation of mainstream media and paying off hundreds of U.S. journalists without the public knowing. They just had them on the payroll. This is an old game, and it has never stopped. So when talks about establishment media, I'm not talking about YouTube people like you and me, but establishment media is very, very controlled. You might as well be talking about the old Soviet model. So when the establishment media is not touching this story, that should tell us something. That should tell us that what came out originally in December of 2017 was not welcome by many players in the upper level of the national security elite. I don't think that they were happy about this. But what they've done is, I think, very astutely taken as much control over the narrative as possible. They've done a very good job. With these so-called UAP hearings that we've seen in the United States over the last couple of years, which I think were designed to be as boring as possible, and also really didn't give a whole lot of information, and also trying to reframe this subject because there's so much that's missing. The whole history of the UFO phenomenon has now gone missing in all these public conversations. You'll notice the Navy, the Air Force, the Pentagon they're talking about UAP all of the 21st century, as if the entire 20th century never existed. That's a lot of history. So they're able to pretend, in other words, that this is a new phenomenon. They are just now beginning to investigate it, and they can play this game of pretend by saying, well, we're going to look into it and we'll get back to you when we learn something. Meanwhile, there's so much overwhelming testimony through the 20th century of UFO crash retrievals, acquisition of bodies, both alive and dead, and on and on. I've gone into this in excruciating detail. None of this has come up. Now, with David Grush, as you just mentioned, he is the latest, and he, I think, is potentially of great significance. He's a young guy. He has some very good bona fides. His background is very, very checkable. We can investigate who he is. He was a member of the UAP task force for 2 years, from 2019 to 2021. He's in a position to know a few things. He was working with the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office. That's very prestigious, major spy agency. They do all spy satellites. And he has come forward and has made some very startling and dramatic claims that, the Pentagon was illegally withholding information from the UAP task force. He stated that when he complained about this, he himself was subject to illegal attacks on him professionally. I don't know the details of those attacks, but he's talked about it. He filed a complaint with the Inspector General of the Pentagon. He won his complaint. And what he has said is that we have multiple craft. And I think he said bodies. And he said that this is dangerous. He says that people have died in their encounters. He didn't get into any specifics. So he's made some very dramatic claims. Of course, the criticism that you hear against him is that, well, he's provided no proof. Well, I think it's a little early in the game to criticize him for that. My attitude is let's just take this one step at a time and realize that he hasn't given us proof just yet. But I'm inclined to say let's wait and see with him, because he does. I've spoken off the record to a number of individuals who know him. I've not spoken with Grush myself. And I know he has many, many prestigious individuals willing to back him up. So for now, that's enough for me. And I'm willing to wait and see what he's got, if he can bring anything forward.
Yeah, I've said a few times on the podcast, I feel the David Grush story will be judged on the follow-up and what happens if indeed he has handed over what he says he has to Congress and others involved in this topic working in the background. Then what comes from that could really be, the fruit that bears from his work and coming forward. And I wonder, though, similar question to what I asked you about how this came to be in the media. How did this get past those same walls of the Pentagon and classified briefings? Because no doubt in the decades preceding what's happening now, there have been conversations that have threatened to almost get out of those kind of hallowed halls. Why has this story, and we've got to say, been allowed to get this far? Because surely the Air Force and others within government, being as big and powerful and as scary as they are, have managed to quash this before. Well,
I'm not sure if that's the way that I would want to phrase it, because I've heard this type of thing before. People 6 years ago said, why would the CIA allow the New York Times to publish those two stories? And I think, we do live in a very controlled information environment, but it is not 100% controlled. We have to recognize there are different forces at play, not only within the establishment, which there are, and I do think that's why those stories got out, because there are factions within the Pentagon and within the national security community. But we shouldn't sell ourselves, we the people, as a factor in this. In other words, I've been looking at this now. I wrote a book on disclosure 13 years ago. I tried to foresee, how could the end of UFO secrecy occur? And if it did, how might that affect our world? And, then as now, I recognized, I think that there are different forces at play. One that we sometimes overlook is the internet itself. Prior to 1990, there really wasn't an internet to speak of, and it was much, much easier for elites to control public conversations than now. Once the internet came, a series, I don't know if that's my Skype or yours, but I'm just going to get out of there.
Oh, that's okay, yeah.
Sorry about that. I think that was me. But I think the internet has been a significant factor. And in fact, if it were not for the internet, I don't think TTSA would have formed when it did, because there was all of these years of momentum developing behind the UFO subject for years and years. I don't think we should forget that. It was a tremendous amount of public pressure building up from below. And that, I think, did affect some of the, if I can call them factions within the Pentagon, within the national security intelligence community. Yes, I think so. So to say, why did they allow? I don't know if I would phrase it that way, because we know, for example, that when Lou Elizondo had come out as a public person a few years ago, there were significant attacks against him by the Pentagon. They tried to say, he never ran the ATIP program. That was a lie. They had to retract that. They said a number of other things to try to diminish his stature. So it was obvious then that they were not happy that Elizondo came out. So why was he able to come out? Well, because he was able, because he had some support behind him, and there were people who opposed him. And I think that's what we are looking at. So the only area where I might quibble with the way you phrase it is that I don't think that we're looking at a monolithic structure. I think we're looking at a structure where we have a kind of labyrinthian bureaucracy where you've got groups fighting against groups. I don't think it's a unified thing.
Well, in After Disclosure that you co-authored with Bryce Zabel. You've asked some key questions within that book, and that includes how disclosure may happen, like you say. And I wonder, Diana Pasulka recently commented with Jay from Project Unity, who I know you know, that we are potentially seeing multiple disclosures happening at once, some at the governmental level, some at the military level, and then at the religious level. And I wonder, is that something you agree with, that they're happening within different compartments?
Oh, this is what Bryce recently said. Yeah, I think I might agree with that. We kind of envisioned a different version of how disclosure would happen. Of course, we wrote this book back in 2010. And this was before, really 4 or 5 years before the internet and social media really started to clamp down, before we started seeing a significant tightening of social media and the internet in general, which we're seeing quite significantly. So back in those days, we imagined disclosure would happen like an avalanche. In other words, there would be some sighting that could not be denied, or some leak, maybe out of WikiLeaks, or as actually has turned out, a public statement by a respected official. We thought maybe that's a possibility. We were thinking someone along the lines of like stature of like Colin Powell or some big shot like that. We weren't thinking someone like David Grush, or Lou Elizondo for that matter. But that did happen. But we didn't see the avalanche for a while. We didn't see this piling on effect. It's taken 6 years. So that was, I think, the big difference that the big thing we did not anticipate. But I think it's possible we're seeing it now. And I'll be honest, I'm surprised that this is happening, that this has happened, that has gone as far as it has gone. I had not expected that someone like Grush would actually make the statements that he did and get them publicly out there. So kudos to him, kudos to Ross Coulthart also for interviewing him, and to Leslie and Ralph for writing the article about him. I think that was all very, very helpful for our public conversation. So the real question is, are we going to see the effect of rats deserting a sinking ship? That's really what I'm wondering. And I do think it's possible. I don't know that it will happen, but we're hearing rumors of other whistleblowers, claims of other whistleblowers that are out there. Not all of them are named, but claims that there are, a dozen or more craft that are secreted away in various installations. We've heard that. I don't have any more specific information. Claims about bodies have been put forward just recently. I don't know where these people are getting their information, but they are circulating around. And so it is possible that we might see something of an avalanche. That would be really quite interesting. But the other thing to keep in mind is that in our little UFO community bubble, this is a huge thing. We all have friends who don't follow this subject. I certainly have friends who don't follow UFOs at all. I was speaking to a couple of them just less than a week ago. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, this has been out for a while, and yet they were oblivious to any of this news. They had not heard at all any of it. And I think there's a lot of folks out there who are in a similar position. So as big as this seems to us, it has not, I don't think it has fully broken through to the point where it's become genuine, widespread conversation in the public. And it could get there. It's possible, but I don't think we're quite there. And so my attitude is there's some toothpaste that's squeezed out of the tube. And I think there's still an effort to put some of that toothpaste back in the tube if that's possible. And if you can't put it back in the tube, they're just going to wipe it off the counter and screw the top back on and put that toothpaste away. In other words, it is still possible, even at this point, for all forward motion to stall and for us not to go any further. It is still possible. I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, the rest of this year is going to be very interesting. Very interesting. And I don't know how to predict it, to be honest. I just chatted with my longtime friend on this matter, Stephen Bassett, who's the long-standing disclosure advocate and one of the most optimistic people on this subject that I'll ever know. Yeah. Steve firmly believes this is going to be the year. He says weeks, not months. And I've never been that optimistic. So we'll have to just see how it plays out.
Richard, I could swear you have read my next 6 or 7 lines of questions, and everything you have just said there, you've jumped all over them, including literally having Stephen Bassett mentioned on there as well in his thoughts. And we're going to get to that in more detail, okay?
Sure.
You mentioned, though, really interestingly, and it's refreshing to hear you say that, the toothpaste could go back in the tube, literally have that line written down. And I think, as tragic as it is, the submersible story that's been taking up the news headlines of the last 4 or 5 days, we're just seeing, as we record this, that they're finding debris in the field where they're searching for the submarine that's gone missing, searching for the Titanic. So it looks like there's been a catastrophic failure. But what that has shown is how a relatively small news story that, let's be honest, in a week, that will be gone from the headlines. If you're listening to this at the end of June or into July, that story will have been moved on and forgotten about. But it's already taken over the headlines. David Grush's story is gone from the mainstream media, as little as it was there, the short time it was there. And I think that just goes to show there's always going to be something else.
Yeah.
Small, a big story. We've got the looming Russia situation in the background with Ukraine still, that's always in the headline and has been now for well over a year. And I see so many folks online and influencers who I respect or I keep up to date with what they're doing, who seem so certain this is definitely happening. It's this summer. And I'll just say, including Stephen Bassett, like you say, have strongly suggested that this is a summer for disclosure. Realistically for you, you say you can't predict where this is going to go. One thing
did you finish? I didn't want to jump ahead of you.
I was going to say, what would be your best case scenario that you realistically think, where could we be by the end of the year? But feel free to come in with whatever you were going to say.
I'll just say this, and I will answer your question to the best that I can. But I think we have, you mentioned the war in Ukraine and Russia, and I don't want to get into that whole thing and get you into trouble. I have an analysis of that whole thing, which is exactly counter to everything that you hear in the Western media. And I think that it's been, that has been covered so dishonestly, and maliciously dishonestly, to the extent that if someone's in the West and they're trying to follow that whole thing based on Western media, they will never, ever, ever understand what actually is going on there. They'll never get it. So it's a dishonest portrayal of the single most important geopolitical event of our time. Our media, in other words, is part of an establishment that cannot be trusted for anything. And that includes for the UAP, UFO information. They are not honest players. We have to understand this. And I think people generally, most of the time, they realize, we have a corrupt situation, a corrupt media. It's more than corrupt. It's captured. It's captured. In other words, there are powerful interests that completely, truly control the information, the established point of view that comes to us. We went through 2+ years of this through COVID lockdowns and all of the beating us over the head with that propaganda. And so people, I think we're kind of, the masks have been ripped off and we can see the system for what it is, at least those of us who care to look at it. So we don't have an honest media in this. There are some good journalists. I think Leslie and Ralph, for example, are honest players. They do good work. But the media establishment as a whole is fundamentally dishonest and cannot be trusted. So my attitude is whatever their message is going to be on UAP or UFOs, I'm expecting it to be coming from a point of view of severe dishonesty. It's like, for example, what is missing? What are they not talking about? One thing they're not talking about is the history of this subject, because to talk about the history implicates the government in a cover-up. They cannot go there. The United States government cannot allow itself, in my view, to be implicated in 80+ years of lies to the public. That's just too messy. That opens up too many questions. And I mean, all kinds of, if people might actually start wondering, well, you lied about UFOs. Did you lie about 9/11? Did you lie about JFK? Did you lie about any number of other things? Did you lie about COVID? This is not a good place for them to be, to acknowledge that there's been an 80-year series of lies about UFOs. And so the history has been kept from us. Another thing that nothing is not being discussed is the ongoing, sheer, vast quantity of UFO sightings that take place around the world every week. It's not like this is a thing that is in the past. We acquired a craft here or there and a body here and there. No. There are black triangles hovering over your neighborhood at 2:30 in the morning on any given night, or over my neighborhood. They are being recorded and seen everywhere. What are they doing hovering at 100 meters over people's homes? I'd like to know. These reports come in all the time to citing report websites that can accept them. I'd like to know what is going on. None of these questions are being asked. They're not even being asked in the UFO community, essentially, and they're certainly not being asked in the major media. There's so much going on with this subject. And then we could talk about alleged abductions if one wants to go there. What are those? I do believe those happen. And so much more. This is a very deep, deep subject that, look, if this is real, what it means is that there are other beings who have come here from someplace else and are doing something. They haven't just come here and then gone back to their planet after crashing once or twice. They're here. What are they doing? And I don't hear a single question coming. Forget the mainstream media. I don't even hear UFO people talking about this. What's going on right now? What's the agenda? Why are they here? Do they have bases in the oceans? Which I'm writing a book on this subject right now, ocean-based UFO sightings. I think, yes, I think they do. What is this? What is the scenario? So by the end of this year, what are we likely to have? Well, it is quite possible that we have not moved 1 inch forward from where we are right now. But it is possible that we've made some, let's call it progress, perhaps by the end of the year. I certainly do not expect the United States president to make a statement on this matter. I mean, frankly, I don't think it would be possible for him to do so. I mean, can anyone imagine Joe Biden making a statement about disclosure? How would that even come out? Is he able? I mean, literally, is he able to even discuss the matter? I don't think so. So I don't think that's going to happen. Perhaps, I think the best that we can hope is that there will be another, either Grush will come out with more information that can be examined, that will probably kickstart a whole back and forth argument between skeptics and supporters, but that might get some traction. Or maybe another whistleblower comes forward because we're hearing about it. And the other thing that is possible is hearings in the United States Congress, or perhaps even the Senate. There is discussion that hearings on the UAP matter will begin. Now, hearings are different from what we've had in the past, which are just briefings. Where a couple of talking heads go in front of a small Senate committee, and whether it's Dr. Kirkpatrick of Arrow or Stephen Bray, Scott Bray, and Ronald Moultrie, those guys. Hearings are different. Hearings are when Congress will subpoena various witnesses to speak on this matter, whistleblowers. And that could be significant. So I guess let me answer your question this way. If there are hearings scheduled, that could be a potential opening in the conversation on this. But I don't think it's going to lead to disclosure. I don't see that happening this year. I could be wrong. I just don't see it happening.
No, that's all very fair, and you've put it well. And I wonder, aside from other news items coming into the media and taking over the conversation around the globe, are there any other bumps in the road you can foresee for this conversation, whether that would be on the surface or behind the scenes?
Yes, absolutely. Because, I mean, fundamentally, you have to wonder how much authority even does the United States Congress have in getting to the true origins of the secrecy on this matter. A couple of years ago, I was part of the controversy relating to the so-called Davis-Wilson notes. Now, these came out. These are actually written by Dr. Eric Davis over 20 years ago now. 20 years ago, 2002. So over 20 years ago. And essentially, that was his interview with Admiral Thomas Wilson, where Wilson is talking off the record and saying, look, I tried to get access to this black budget program to reverse engineer ET tech. I was denied access. And it was a very explosive conversation. As I've said many times, I was actually shown a partial transcript of that back in 2006, long time ago. I've known about it. I've talked about it. I've talked about it in the way that I was able to talk about it for several years, but I've known about it. So when it came out, it leaked out fully in 2019. What you learn when you study those detailed notes that Davis wrote is the structure of UFO secrecy, and at least in the Pentagon. And what we see is that in the Pentagon's massive bureaucracy, there are different offices where these programs can be buried. I mean, really buried. So there's an office within the Pentagon called SAPOC, Special Access Program Oversight Committee, SAPOC. And it was through that office, we learn in these notes, that you've got a bunch of special access programs, black budget programs that are buried there, very difficult to find. And you've got programs nested within other programs, nested within those, nested within those. And this was what came out there. And what we find is that oversight over those programs was honestly little to none. A little bit of oversight by a couple of guys in the Pentagon. That's it. These are run by private contractors. We're talking Lockheed Martin, I'm sure Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, the usual suspects. And they just do what they want. They are the ones who decide who's in and who's not in on the program. Wilson, who at the time was number two, he was deputy head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had a very responsible position. He believed that he rightfully should oversee this program that he found. And the contractors sat down with him. They said, "No, we're not letting you in." He said, "Well, I'm just going to go. I'll complain. I'll go up the chain of command and complain." They said, "Be our guest. We don't care. We're not afraid of you." He did go back to D.C. He did complain, and he was threatened with his career. He was furious, but there was nothing he could do about it. So this is a situation, in other words, where the secrecy is so deep, it is so protected, and it's largely, a lot of it has been privatized. And so getting to the bottom of this secret, this UFO, UAP secret, it's not easy. And then the other question is, you have to ask. I'm an American citizen. I'm here in the United States, and we can ask, is the United States government the final authority in charge of this? I grew up thinking, oh, sure, well, it has to be the United States government. Who's bigger and badder than the United States government? Well, what you find when you study the structure of UFO secrecy, just as when we look at the structure of power internationally, we see it's not all just one country. The United States is an important player. Yes, of course. The U.S. has a military. It's got a massive intelligence community. It's very important operationally. But who's making the executive decisions here? We talk about, internationally, places like Davos and the World Economic Forum, or the Bilderberg meetings, or the Council on Foreign Relations, or the Trilateral Commission, or the Bohemian Grove, and all of these unofficial groups where elite, powerful people get together without government oversight, and they just decide what they want the world to be like, and then they go back to their areas and they make it happen. And I think that's the model for the UFO cover-up. So the real question is, I don't think anyone can imagine that U.S. President Joe Biden's running the UFO cover-up. So if he's not running it, then who is? Is it an office within the U.S. government? And I don't think so. I think it's beyond that. I think we're looking at very, very powerful behind-the-scenes groups that have the information, that have access to a tremendous amount of money, that very likely are kind of like an international independent mafia, which is basically my model for how the world works anyway. It's a series of mafioso organizations. I'm a big fan of the Godfather movie, my favorite movie of all time. And you've got the Five Families of New York. That is my model for how the world is. And I think it's very likely how the UFO cover-up operates as well. I think you've got behind-the-scenes intimidation, blackmail, bribery, threats of all sorts. This secret is kept down at times, I think, through severe levels of intimidation and worse. So I don't think the U.S. Just to answer, I don't think the U.S. Congress is going to have the ability to get to the bottom of this. They can try, and they should try, but how far they're going to get would be very interesting.
Yeah, they're always going to get to that extra door, aren't they, that no one's going to answer, and no one's going to tell them how to get through that door, and that door is going to remain locked as long as that door, the people behind it have the will to keep it locked.
Yes.
You've mentioned on your own show about the red line of disclosure, and I just wonder, could you explain in your own words to the listeners and viewers what that is?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Basically, the red line is the line you must not cross. It's the line beyond which potentially catastrophic results can happen. And in my view, the real red line of disclosure is acknowledgement of crash retrievals of technology and bodies. I think that's the real red line. For the United States government to say, we have in fact recovered craft, we have them in our possession. The reason I think that's the red line is because it implicates, more than implicates, it proves that the United States government has actively lied to the world for essentially an entire human lifetime. And I just see that as a very difficult position for the U.S. government to put itself into willingly. Now, that red line at some point will be crossed. I've often said, UFO disclosure is a paradox. It's impossible and it's inevitable. It's both. It is really both. It is impossible in the sense that there's no motivation, as I see it, for those who have this secret ever willingly to give it up. But in a sense, you could say it's inevitable, like the end of secrecy. Nothing can be secret forever, can it? I don't think so. At some point, this secret is likely to come out. Although bear in mind, we still don't have an official truth on the JFK assassination, and that was over 60 years ago. And we're still lied to, basically, by that. But I think the UFO secret one day will come out. And but how? And what was your question? I think I just lost my train of thought here, Andy. I'm so sorry.
No, it was just your explanation of what that red line of disclosure is.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I would love to, if you could follow up, though, with that. Do you think there's a way that disclosure can happen that satisfies the needs of the UFO community, which you're right is a small bubble, the public, which is the 99.9%, and also the gatekeepers of the secrets? Is there any way it can happen that, and it actually goes back to what you said before, that, and I don't know about this point, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, that the US government acknowledging the UFO truth, shall we say, would be an admission of 90 years of lies and potential criminal investigations. Would the masses, 99.9%, the friends that you have, the friends that I have, the people who don't listen to this, that don't read your books, that don't necessarily care about the UFO topic like we do, will they care about the 90 years of lies when they find out there are aliens on the planet? Because for me, that puts a full stop and everyone moves on. You might still have a small section of UFO Twitter complaining about, okay, so what happened at Roswell and, Philip Corso and Rendlesham. Most people
I think you're hitting the nail on the head here. I think you're speaking to a very fundamentally important point. I look at myself and my life, and I'm not a normal person. I'm a crazy fanatic who has been thrown into this field for 30 years. And before that, I was a fanatic about all other kinds of scholarly ventures and things like that. I live in the world of ideas. Ideas matter to me. They're important to me. I think they're important to you. Probably they're important to many of the listeners of this podcast. But to most people, no, they're not. And that's not to criticize them. I grew up in a very working class family. Totally working class family. I would never expect my dear departed grandmother to have gotten into this issue and grasp it. Like, that's not what she was about. And I would never expect that of her, nor of so many other wonderful, beautiful friends that I've had in my life. That we're all that way. And so, unfortunately, people are extremely easy to manipulate. Unbelievably easy. It is so easy. And in fact, it's easier now than I think ever before, because I think organizations that are running propaganda, that they really know what they're doing. They're very, very good at this. So I think it's, unless someone is really dedicated to ripping through the many veils that exist to block our vision of reality, it's never going to happen. It's very difficult. Look, I've fanatically tried to do this for more than 40 years. More than 40 years since I was a young man. And I'm still learning. It's still difficult. And I have all of these advantages. Like I've been dedicated to doing it, and I have a good memory, and I can look at these things, and I still struggle. It's still a challenge for me. How can any of my neighbors be expected to really get this? I mean, they don't have the desire. Most people don't really have much of an education in these matters either. So it's going to be very easy to manipulate the public. I think what's happening is, 10 plus years ago, I used to describe disclosure as like a foot race between the public and the elites, as it were. So if the public got to the finish line first, that would mean we were able to get a major leak or major truth bomb out there before the global system is locked down. Because really what we're living in is a global revolution right now. No one talks about it like this. No one calls it a global revolution. But you and I and everyone watching this, we are living in a global revolution. It is centrally directed. It is breathtaking in its power and scope. COVID proved this, if anyone really doubts it, when you see the identical nature of all of the talking points of all the governments, the identical nature of their lockdown measures. All of this was centrally coordinated. When we see the imposition of a complete digital 24/7 surveillance over people in a whole variety of ways, and the creation of essentially a global technocracy, that literally is what we are seeing. So if they get to the finish line first, in other words, if they can create a completely curated, controlled global information system, then they win because disclosure will be very carefully managed on their terms according to their narrative, and it will be very difficult for outsiders or independent researchers to be able to get an alternate point of view in. And I do think that's what's happening. I think that to me, it looks like the global revolution forces have the advantage. It's not game over yet, but I think they have the advantage in this struggle.
You made a point earlier about how it's almost laughable that we are learning about the UFO topic for the first time because the US government is learning about it for the first time as it goes along and goes, oh, Tic Tacs appeared in 2004. We should investigate this. Let's create a task force. And it's almost, they're pretending the history of the subject never happened. Given everything you've just said in the last half hour or so, is it almost inevitable and acceptable that if that's how we're going to get some form of capital D disclosure, that someone like yourself or myself just has to accept it as, okay, if this is how it's going to be and we have to forget the past almost for now, would you go along with that being disclosure, an acceptable disclosure?
Well, it wouldn't be for me. It would be very difficult for a higher authority to shut me up and to make me stop talking about all of the incredible UFO history that exists. I've written 2 volumes of that history. I have more that are on the way. And to me, the history, Bob Marley, didn't he say, if you know your history, then you know where you're coming from. We have to know our history. And if we lose our history, we really do lose ourselves. And we are moving into a truly Orwellian era. We're already in it, but it just gets worse, where history is rewritten, history is erased. This is what happened in the old Soviet era. It's really not any different. It's like not any different, maybe by a slight matter of degree, but I don't even know if that's significant anymore. That like those individuals, Soviet era intellectuals in Eastern Europe and in the old Soviet Union, they had to struggle. They had to just wait it out. They had to just live the best they could and speak as freely as they were able to. And they had to deal with a very repressive system. And I tend to believe that is what we are here moving into. I think we are moving into a very intellectually repressive system in the service of a global revolution that I think those people who think that they're smart enough to run our world, they think that they can do. And where these other beings fit in is really the big, big question. And every once in a while, I have to ask, is there a relationship between this dramatic global revolution that we are seeing right now and 80 plus years of intense presence by other beings on this planet? These beings may have been here even longer than that. But in my view, when I look at the numbers, when I look at the scale, something changed in the middle of the 20th century where large numbers, I think, of them arrived here. What's their attitude about what we're doing? I think that they probably support this because what we're doing is we're turning ourselves into something like them. We're creating something like a hive mind, really, in a way. We're creating an integrated digital system where information is tracked, where people are tracked, where there's really not going to be any more wiggle room for things like freedom any longer, or much less. And I think, is this what they think we're supposed to do? Is this the next stage of humanity where we turn ourselves into a big giant anthill? I don't know. But I do know that I was not born into that world. I was born into a world where I believe in freedom, where I believe in freedom of inquiry. And so, for my part, I'm always going to continue doing what I do, which is to delve into the truth about the UFO phenomenon, the history, which must never be forgotten, and all of the other uncomfortable aspects of this subject, which include things, I think, like abductions, personal encounters, and an agenda, or multiple agendas, perhaps, by these other beings. To me, this is important. And if we're not talking about what these other beings are about, then, that's not good for us, because we need to understand, if this is real, then that means there are other intelligences that are operating here. And if we're 80 or 90 or more years into this, and we're only now just publicly asking, hey, what is this after all? We're really behind. We really need to bring up our game and start asking better questions.
Yeah, and you make a really good point as well, that these other beings would have to have an awareness of that situation, because you could keep the best secret on the planet for the longest time. But if the other being, other person, whatever that secret may be, they have their role to play. And if they come forward and they park a Tic Tac next to the Eiffel Tower in Paris, short of saying the old flying saucer on the White House lawn, that changes everything, doesn't it? Or even for the United States, if Russia and or China, for example, come forward and say something first, that again changes the whole conversation, and there's a scramble for a control of the narrative at that point. So is this potentially a case of the US and whichever controlling power you feel is behind that, because the US is very much at the forefront of this, whether we like it or not, in terms of a global conversation right now on the face of things, then you want to get ahead of the conversation, much like Leslie and Ralph did with the New York Times, that the US would say, do you know what, let's control this as best we can. Is that then what's happening?
Yes, I think... Yes, there's definitely that among the members of the elite class. Although in the last article by Leslie and Ralph, I mean, they published that in the Debrief, which is, I wouldn't quite say fringe, but it's a smaller publication that's, I don't think, is part of that whole establishment nexus. So I think Leslie and Ralph got that article out because they were literally unable to put it in any other establishment publication. And in fact, that has muted its effectiveness. Like if the New York Times would have published that piece, or even the Washington Post, it would have had more power as a news story than it did. You mentioned the aliens landing next to the Eiffel Tower, and the fact they haven't done that. They haven't landed openly in a way that would allow the rest of the world to say, "Aha, they're here." So they have their own agenda for secrecy, and Russia and China. Certainly Russia has had a very extensive history of interaction with these UFOs. I think China has also. We don't know as much about China's history there, but I remember chatting with Sun Shi of China. I think he's their leading UFO researcher. He has said that he believes China has recovered at least one craft in the 1990s. Maybe true. Russia, we know, has had a lot of interaction, and yet they're saying nothing. Russia says nothing. And so the question is why? And I think because all of these nations the leaders realize that this is a can of worms that once is opened, or it's like Pandora's box is a better analogy. Once it's opened, it's going to be very difficult to contain or predict what the next thing will be. And instability is something these nations don't want. They don't want that. especially a country like Russia, which relies, at least in large part, on exporting its natural gas and petroleum products. You have to wonder, is there a post-petroleum secret, implicit in the UFO mystery? I mean, after all, whatever these objects are using to get by from point A to point B, it's probably not gasoline. It's probably something better than that. And so you could argue it's a threat to the petroleum-based system that we have. And I can't imagine Russia would be excited about challenging that. The Chinese would probably have their own reasons for not disclosing, and as does the United States. So the real power players in this world, I think, are united in their desire probably to keep this as secret as long as possible.
And we're marching towards the end of our time, so I want to finish off with a few questions. And ideally, I've got a couple of listener questions to touch on as well. I wanted to know, Richard, in the last almost 6 years since that New York Times article, what's been the biggest thing that surprised you about the journey we've been on?
I think I was very impressed by the New York Times article in 2019, I think May of 2019 or April, that Leslie and Ralph and Helene Cooper, I think, was part of it, where they talked about the USS Roosevelt off the eastern coast of the United States. And that was where we learned about Ryan Graves, Navy pilot, where we learned of the massive number of encounters that took place in 2014 and 2015 off the eastern United States coast with the Roosevelt Carrier Group. Those I thought were quite extraordinary. And actually, we've had a number of remarkable leaks. Jeremy Corbell, filmmaker and I guess a friend of mine, I've known Jeremy for almost 10 years now, has done very good work in getting some leaked data out as well. Some of it's quite impressive. I mean, the object that appears to be dropping into the water off the coast of California, I think is quite extraordinary. And I think that qualifies as a genuine USO, underwater UFO. So there's been some really interesting UFO cases that have come out since the door was open in 2017. I think it's been very interesting to see that, reaching the public, which in previous years, not much was reaching the public. So I think that's been interesting. The fact that the United States government has taken even what baby steps it has toward looking at this matter. Some of it, I think, has been disingenuous. Anything that the Pentagon does, I think, is not to be taken on good faith. But I wonder about some members of U.S. Congress, and some of them strike me as genuinely interested in getting to the bottom of this matter. So I think that's been interesting. It's been interesting to see that there are people in positions of public responsibility and power who are willing to talk in a positive way about the UFO reality as if it's real, which it is real. So I think that's been a positive thing, but it hasn't really made its way to any level of public acknowledgement that's affecting the public in any way yet. So we have such a long way to go.
A good time to mention, Jeremy Corbell was on the podcast last year and very kindly has kept in touch with me ever since, and should be coming back on in a few weeks' time. So for anyone checking out this interview purely because you're on, Richard, Jeremy Corbell will be back on very, very soon. And he's done a lot of great work in the last few months along with George Knapp.
Yes.
And I wonder, I was going to ask this earlier and I skipped past it because the conversation moved on. Who do you, Richard Dolan, look to for your UFO news? Do you have any particular outlets or podcasts or particular journalists that you think are the go-to folks for UFO news?
Not as many as I probably should. I deal with a lot of historical information, so I read a lot of old books. But in terms of contemporary stuff, I remain friends and friendly with Linda Moulton Howe. I adore Linda. I try to catch her YouTube as often as I can. It's not often enough. I do think Jeremy and George Knapp do excellent work, and I do like to follow their show Weaponized. For video stuff, I don't really watch too much else, but there are UFO websites that I go to for research purposes on a regular basis. And, In terms of getting the news, honestly, people write to me all the time. So I don't really need to even be hunting this stuff down. It's crazy. But anytime, like when Grush came out with his statement, that was on June 5th, my inbox was flooded with all kinds of people letting me know, oh, there's this new bombshell. Of course, my wife, Tracy, saw it before any of those people and woke me up and said, you're going to need to deal with this. So I'm in a good position where I've got folks constantly peppering me with information. A few of them are just private friends who are very much on top of contemporary UFO news, and they have access to me, and they will feed me the information that they know I want.
What's been your biggest change in mindset from Richard Dolan of 2000, say, or even the mid-1990s to 2023? Is there anything you say, wow, I've really swung from A to B on that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, I was trained in my historical work way back in olden times not to believe in grand conspiracies. It's really an important thing within the academic world, especially the Department of History where I was studying. That was considered really loose-headed to believe in conspiracies of any sort. It's really kind of a weird thing, but it was ingrained in the Department of History where I was studying. You could believe in bad motivations by people and things like this, but conspiracies, no, absolutely not. And once I started delving into the UFO subject, I was very hesitant. It really was difficult for me to go into a conclusion that there really was a grand conspiracy to cover up knowledge about the UFO subject. But after studying it long enough, I could not come to any other conclusion. So that was an early one. Another dramatic change is in the nature, not just what I think of the nature of the phenomenon, but really by extension, what I think in the nature of reality itself. I got into studying remote viewing because of the UFO subject. I became aware that there are these guys called remote viewers who were, trained through CIA and Stanford Research Institute, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, both of whom are friends of mine to this day. I know Hal and Russell quite well. That they train these guys who are like psychic spies. And I learned early on that these people were bumping into extraterrestrials in their psychic journeys. And I became interested in that. I was like, what is going on with that? Is this real? Is this fantasy? Well, I don't think it's fantasy, not at all. I married a remote viewer, but I also have come to understand a lot about that program. And delving into that has dramatically transformed my idea, not just of these alien beings, but of what our reality even is. I mean, to me, it's far more interesting than I could have thought back in the 1990s when I was still very much in a kind of a mechanistic worldview. So that's changed. I've when I started out, I didn't want to get into anything that was really, truly bizarre. I was so conservative in the 1990s with this. In fact, I used to joke with myself. I said, well, I'll study UFOs, but nothing weird. Like no abductions, no crop circles, no psi phenomena, nothing really, truly bizarre. I didn't want to get into that. I just was nuts and bolts, just the facts. But the fact is that's like analogous to going to this incredible beach, this amazing ocean, and you go out to the shore and you just dip your toe in the little bit of the water in the front and you don't go swimming. But at some point, well, you have to go swimming if you want to experience what this is. So what I've come to see is that the UFO subject, for me anyway, opened a doorway to a very thorough, I would say, reevaluation of reality in almost any way that I can imagine. So it's been a genuine education, far, far beyond anything that I could have predicted 30 years ago when I started this. I could not have seen where I was going.
So on that note, if you could stick your head back through a portal on Skinwalker Ranch and tell yourself, 30 years ago, a little bit of advice, what would it be?
In terms of this subject, I would actually say, go straight ahead, go do exactly what you think you want to do. I think the best thing to say to anybody who's starting out in this is be fearless. Make yourself fearless. because this is a hell of a topic. And when I say fearless, I mean, don't be afraid to challenge the assumptions that you grew up with, that you think govern the world, because they're probably wrong. I remembered reading in a book by John Mack, who, of course, was a great thinker who was into the UFO subject. Of course, John Mack, a Harvard psychologist. And one thing John Mack said, I can't remember which of his books. He said, really, what we do in this world is we're born into a world of illusion. And our job is to, if we care about this, is to strip away those illusions and arrive into the realm of truth. I think that's right. But to do that it's difficult, because we need, all of us, I include myself here, we all need a kind of psychological foundation upon which we can deal with the world. We have to know, like, what do we believe? What's true? What's not true? And when you come to rely on a certain thing being true, and then you discover one day that it wasn't true, that's a very difficult thing to confront, because it also tells you that all of those years in your past, you were basing your actions on false ideas. And nobody wants to believe that, especially someone who is college educated, or they think that they're educated. They think they're ahead of the curve. They think they're smart. I'll tell you, people who are professionally accomplished, this is not what they want to hear. You don't want to be 45 years old and then realize, holy shit, everything I thought I knew was just completely wrong.
Yeah.
That's not what you want to hear. It's difficult. So to confront it, you really have to be brave. It requires genuine bravery and the willingness to change your opinion. I've had to change my opinion even within the UFO field many times, and when you become publicly known, it's harder to change your opinion, by the way, because there's all this pressure. Everyone forms their idea about what they think you're supposed to be. And it's all too easy. I've seen this with a lot of other public figures, frankly, where they stake out their little intellectual turf, and that's their safety zone. And they don't want to challenge it because they've made their public career in this capacity. I know this is true of certain UFO skeptics. I know for a fact that they have to maintain where they are because they've created that space for themselves. That's their public space. And then you just, you convince yourself. We all find ways of lying to ourselves and making ourselves believe things. But I think the real truth is really being honest. That's the hardest thing to do, really being honest with oneself about one's beliefs, to say nothing about what we are personally in our personal lives. That's a whole other thing. But just being honest with ourselves about what is true and what is not true, that takes guts. And anyone who goes through that process has my respect. I don't need to agree with them on the specifics of this phenomenon. My point is, if someone's on that journey and they are questioning their reality, well done.
Well, a few folks who have questioned the reality got in touch with some listener questions. If we could fire through a couple of these, Richard, and we'll keep the rest for next time. Wayne from the Philippines says he's a big fan of both of our shows, so thank you. He asks, do we really need disclosure, or is ignorance bliss?
I guess that depends on your perspective of life, I mean, for me, I've heard this many times. People would say, we don't need disclosure. We know what's true. I know the truth. And the answer to that is yes, you do know the truth. Like, you don't need the government to tell you what is true. We'll get to the ignorance is bliss part in a moment. But for that part, what I would say is disclosure does matter if you care about genuine, let us say, democratic governance, democratic institutions. If you believe that the government is responsible to you and not the reverse, if you believe that you, the citizen, are sovereign, if you have that belief, then I think disclosure should matter. Because government is, if you hold that belief, maybe kind of social contract theory or something like that, then it's not to prove that aliens are real. It's to keep the government responsible to you. We don't want to have a society in which government actors can just willfully lie to us and treat us like we're 4 years old and spoon feed us bullshit for the rest of our lives. We don't want that, do we? I don't think we do. So on that basis, I think disclosure is very important. Now, the whole thing about ignorance is bliss. Yes, it is. It's bliss until reality bites you in the ass, and it's not. But for the most part, ignorance is bliss. Yeah. I've got friends, I hear them talking about the local football teams and that stuff. And I'm like, you know what? I kind of admire it. I can't go there. It's not possible for me at this point. I grew up following sports. I love it. It's fun, but I can't get into that mindset. But I have people out in the world that I know them, they're friends, and that's important to them, and they live in that world. And that's fine. I have other friends, they live on, Facebook rumors and what their friends are doing and this and all of that. And that's their world. And who am I to say that you shouldn't do that? It's not for me to say. People have to find their own way to achieve genuine happiness in their world. And it is certainly not for me to say, you need to know everything about the conspiracies and cover-ups that are going on in this world. Unfortunately, that helps these types of things continue because you have an apathetic public. But it's also not fair for me to expect someone who is not, they don't have the background, they don't have the desire. It's not fair for me to expect them to get on board with everything that I'm doing or that you're doing. So ignorance can be bliss. It's not for me to fault them. But for those who care about the UFO subject, for those who are interested in it, I think disclosure does matter to the extent of public. It's a matter of public responsibility by the government to be responsive and not to just lie. You realize we don't even expect truth from our governments anymore. We literally don't expect them to be truthful. And so we don't get that angry when we know they lie to us. 50, 60, 70 years ago, our grandparents would have been absolutely furious at that type of an attitude. They would not have it. They were lied to also, but they didn't realize they were being lied to. And they would have cared a lot more than I think we care today. I think we've devolved to a point where we just accept the lies. And that's a bad place to be. I don't think we want to be there.
Yeah, I think society is massively desensitized to that. And I think and I'll include my own wife in this, who won't listen to this. So if people want to tag her on Twitter, feel free. But if indeed we had that announcement this evening that aliens were real and here's the craft and the bodies, my wife would say, wow, that's incredible. Okay, back to the Kardashians, back to Real Housewives of Orange County. That's what would happen. I think still for a lot of folks, it would be okay, what's on TV tonight? And things move on.
Well, it's true. Partly, there's entertainment like that, if we want to call that entertainment, but there's a reality. People have jobs. If there is a genuine disclosure, you're still probably going to have to go to work the next day. So we still have lives that we have to live. And so we can't allow ourselves to be dominated, even by this profound reality. Life will continue. But I guess I've said everything I can say on that at the moment.
No, that's very fair. A question from Newman, and Newman always sends in some good questions. Can we take experiencer accounts about the nature, behaviour and societal organisation of the Greys/ETs as a warning for our own possible dangerous point of convergence of humanity's own future development? If so, how can humanity position itself to prevent from becoming like our visitors?
Well, Newman, outstanding question. I will just say, dude, I covered this at great length in a recent book of mine called The Alien Agendas. This was possibly my number one theme. And it's disturbing to me. I have a theory, I believe this is true, that humanity is entering what I call our fourth stage of humanity. What is that? Well, our first stage we had for hundreds of thousands of years. We lived as hunters and gatherers. All human societies did this. About 10,000 years ago, we entered our second stage, which was when we domesticated animals and we domesticated plants and had agriculture and started settling into larger towns. That gave us ancient Egypt. That gave us the Roman Empire. That gave us the Italian Renaissance. It was a great run. We did great with it. A few hundred years ago, we entered our third stage, which was science and industry, the Industrial Revolution, the scientific revolution, that totally transformed our world. I think those are the fundamentals. There's variations within them, of course, but you really think about it, they created a new social organization, political organization, economics, cosmology, worldview. They were fundamental. And now I think we're moving into a fourth stage, which is partly transhumanism, partly just total digital control, digital information management, an integrated digital system, perhaps we can call it. And also, age of computers and age of artificial intelligence, all of that. It's fundamentally going to transform human nature into what I can't help but think is a kind of hive mind or a big anthill. And we are serving that system. We can't help but serve that system. I believe that aliens have achieved that level of reality already. The Greys, I think, are one iteration, one example of that. Yes, I do believe that. And I do think that we are moving toward that type of a model. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to see it happen. But I think maybe in a few centuries, we're going to have a very, very, very radically different social organization than we have now. And it is likely to be more like what we see in accounts of these other beings. I do think that, yes. How to stop it? Because I don't think it's a good thing, but am I just like Grandpa Simpson shouting, shaking my fist at the clouds? Is that what I'm doing? Maybe that's all that is. I'm complaining about something that I have no ability to change and that perhaps is inevitable. Maybe it is. I don't know. But I see it as an unfortunate development. I don't think I want to see humanity turn into something like that. To me, that just seems like a waste. But here's the thing. I have been thinking a lot about the development of human societies of late. I'm very deeply interested in things like paleoanthropology, and I don't really talk about this with ancient aliens people, but I'm deeply interested in our origin as a species and as a civilization. It's important to me. And what I believe is that all of our evolution as a species and in our technology has had one and only one purpose, which is to increase the power of the human social organization, the human group. That's really what it comes down to. That's why we organize militarily. That's why we developed language. I think that's why we developed tools and weapons. We had the cognitive ability to do so, but we developed cognitive ability through our evolutionary process. It was a very unusual thing, but we did it. And all of our developments as a society ever since have been to increase the power of the group over other groups. And so there has been, in other words, a kind of inexorable logic to all development of the human species ever since we reached that threshold where we had a cognitive threshold. And we're seeing it now. It's never stopped. So, from the invention of the spear, to the invention of the arrow, to metallurgy, to pottery, all of those things increase the power of the group. And that means even social organization, where you have like an Egyptian pharaoh, he's the god king. Well, he was actually necessary for that society at that time for it to have its most powerful group expression, I believe. And that's all we're seeing now. So will, strong AI and transhumanism and 24/7 surveillance and kind of minority reporting of you as a psychological profile, are all of that going to be inevitable to increase the power of our human group? It will diminish our power perhaps individually, but to increase the power of the collective. And I think that's what it's all about. And I do think we are looking at that type of a development, and that is likely to bring us more in line with some of these other extraterrestrial groups that I believe are here. So anyway, I think Newman had a great question. Is there a way to stop that? I don't know. I really don't know how to stop that.
Well, if you'll do me one final listener question for this effort, you've been very gracious with your time, Richard. Question from Peter. Peter sent in about 5 questions, so I've picked one. All of a relatively similar theme, so thanks, Peter. Richard has stated that Dr. Stephen Greer's view that all non-human intelligences are entirely benevolent and that abductions and animal mutilations are US government disinformation is mistaken and a naive, if not a dangerous assumption. What is the best historical evidence that Richard would would point to that clearly disproves Greer's hypothesis?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think that I could easily put together a mass of evidence to support what I say here. The one of the problems that I have is, first of all, there's a statement that he has made multiple times that literally all extraterrestrial groups that are here are non-hostile. He has said this explicitly. That's almost a verbatim quote. And he said it more than once. All are non-hostile. So question number one is, it's not on me to disprove him. In my view, it is on him to prove his statement. And the argument he has given time and again is utterly specious. The argument he has given is that, well, they haven't declared war on us or blown us up. That proves they're not hostile, to which I say that's utter nonsense. That's some of the weakest reasoning I could imagine. Earth is incredibly valuable. Why would you want to nuke or destroy Earth to wipe out humanity if you want this planet? You wouldn't do that. This planet is far too valuable. There may be other planets that have life on them, but they may not all be like Earth. We have life everywhere. We are teeming with an unbelievable amount of life. This is an incredibly lucky place for us to be, and has got to be valuable. I don't care how many other planets are there that have life. I'm sure there's other planets that have life, but they are not all right next door to each other. What we have is a beautiful gem out in space, and we get to live here. So no, the fact that aliens haven't declared war and blown us up, that's a ridiculous argument that he made to prove that they're not hostile. There are all kinds of bits of evidence of infiltration. I personally have spoken with a number of individuals who have told me directly of their encounters with human-looking non-humans. That doesn't mean that these non-humans are malevolent. I don't know that they're malevolent. They may be on a mission that I can't quite get or fathom. But the fact is, they are here covertly. I don't like that. I'm allowed not to like that. I'm allowed to criticize the fact that there's a covert, clandestine presence, whether of human-looking or non-human-looking beings that are here doing things. I would like to know what the hell that's about. Now, maybe they're not hostile, but that doesn't mean that I need to be sanguine about it and just say, oh, yeah, well, they're fine. They're here to help us. I don't know that they're here to help us. I'd like to know. They are life forms just like we are. They were undoubtedly apex predators on their world as we are here. Apex predators means you are used to getting your own way, just like we are. We take it for granted that we can just run this planet. Take the sheep, take the goats, take the cows and say, okay, you're working for us now, and I'm going to chop you up and eat in a little while. You're going to live here. We just do that because we feel we can, and we're able to. They're probably the same way. That's how they got here. They're used to achievement. They're used to excelling in what they do. But in terms of evidence, talking about his theory of programmable life forms, PLFs. All right. So if there have been PLFs since the 1960s, 1950s, there are cases of these beings reported that early. There are even cases that reports earlier still, but let's just leave those aside. Is he to tell me that we really invented PLFs in the 1960s? Really? I don't believe it. I'll call absolute BS on that every time. Even in the 1970s, even in the 1980s, I don't believe it. I don't see the science there. This is a highly, highly sophisticated genetic engineering and cybernetics. I don't see a shred of evidence, even in the black world, that makes me believe that they had this ability. And to my knowledge, Greer hasn't put forth any evidence whatsoever about these PLFs. I know other people talk about, Linda Moulton Howe has even talked about PLFs. But look, I'm going to need a little bit more than someone's talk and allegation. I need something. A little bit of science would be helpful. There's just there's nothing to hang your hat on here. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a black budget world where there are men in black and things like that. But we're talking alien programmable life forms, as he puts it. And so really, no, the onus is not on me to disprove him. The onus is on him really to make his case, which in my view, he has never done. And I'll just say the last thing. The reason I think that it is actually dangerous to say some of the things he said is Because if we're in a situation, which it looks like, where you've got a large-scale presence around the world of high level of intelligence doing something, including dead of night abductions and dead of night surveillance, well, I think we are entitled to ask, what's this all about? What is going on? And for someone to say, oh, well, we know they're the good guys and our military are the bad guys, and we just need to let them do what they're doing, and we need to not shoot at them and all of this. He's not in a position to say that. And I don't know what the full answer is. Are they all negative? I'm sure they're not all negative to us, I would imagine. Are some potentially negative to us? Why would that be so difficult to believe? Why is it an outrageous statement to say that at least one or maybe more than one of these groups really considers us to be a nuisance? Because when you get right down to it, we are a nuisance. We are a species that doesn't play nice. We don't play nice with other species on this planet. We absolutely are used to getting our own way. We have done, whether you're conservative or liberal or whatever, we've done a lot of damage to our global environment. We had a pristine, beautiful, natural world, and it's not so pristine any longer, not by a long shot. So we are destructive. It is not difficult to imagine another species coming here, looking at this world and seeing the apex predators, humans, thinking they're very intelligent, but they're really difficult, and we don't want them around. We can do better with this world than they are. Now, maybe they're right, maybe they're not right, but you know what? I'm a human being. I'm siding with my species here. And I think we have a right to try to fix our own problems without another species interacting with us in a clandestine manner that has been going on now for a long, long time. I'd like to know what's going on. So, no, I think that statements coming from individuals who are absolutely certain that they are right and that there's no disagreeing with them, I think it's foolish, for one, but it's also potentially very dangerous. So I'm glad that person, Paul or Peter, asked that question.
Yeah.
Peter, yes, thank you.
Yeah, and there's a whole plethora of areas we could get into there to take the conversation a different way, but you've got a day to get on with, and it's been wonderful talking with you, Richard. I would just like you to mention what you're working on at the moment. You mentioned earlier a book on underwater submerged objects. If you want to talk anything about that or what you're working on.
Sure, yeah, I'll gladly. Thank you. So I wrote 2 very large volumes of history called UFOs in the National Security State. And ever since I wrote those, I've had people asking me, what about volume 3? Well, that will happen. But I've written a few books in between in the interim, and I'm writing this book now. So this is, I think, will be the first ever true history of water-based UFOs. There's been some very good work on water UFOs in the past. I think most notably by the late researcher Carl Feind, who just died a few years ago. Carl did fantastic work on this. There was also a book years ago by Ivan Sanderson called Invisible Residents, which is a fine book. But these are not histories of USOs, that is, unidentified submersible objects. So what I've done is I got into this about a year ago on my website, which is richarddolanmembers.com, and I did a little bit of quiet research there on some water-based UFO cases, and I just threw myself into it about a year ago. And I thought, I want to put this together. I just became obsessed by it, to be honest. I don't have a lot of experience over the water. I'm not a water person. I'm not even a great swimmer, to be honest with you. But I've studied these water-based sightings in great detail now. And so what I've tried to do is to collect them all, analyze them to the best of my ability, and to include the cases that I think are actually legit, and to write about them the best I can. I'm getting it illustrated as well. So it's going to be a very large book. I've got 300 completed pages right now, and that takes me to the beginning of 1980. So I've got a way to go. But it's actually coming along very well. I'm excited by what I have. It's the most engaging book project I've done in a long time. I'm really enjoying it. I haven't done much with it in the last month or two, only because I had a recent event in California, Contact in the Desert, And then now this David Grush news has come out, and it's kind of taken my attention here. But I'm anxious to get back to that, and I'd like to finish that book by the end of this year. I think it would be a useful book for the field. It's something that we don't have, and so I'd like to get that done. When that's finished, I do think the time is right for me to just continue on and try to finish volume 3 of UFOs and the National Security State, which has hung over my head for more than 13, 14 years. So I'll get that going.
Look,
that may end up in 2 more volumes, and maybe a 4th. We'll see. I'm going to look over the data and see if I can do this in 1 more volume or not, and I'll figure it out.
Well, excellent timing. Someone asked last night, I was speaking to Graham Rendell, author and historian. Someone asked him about writing about USOs, and he mentioned it wasn't his area of expertise, and someone should definitely do that. So,
who is this you're speaking of? I didn't.
Graham Rendell, excellent author on Foo Fighters, some of his books going back to the 40s and 50s. Wonderful historian.
Excellent.
And yeah, local to me, friend of mine. Well worth checking out if you get the chance. He's going to be
I'd like to.
The Roswell event with Bryce Zabel in the next week or so. He'll be speaking there as well. So,
excellent.
Yeah. But Richard, fantastic speaking to you finally. I hope to have you back on before the end of the year. Would be a wonderful Christmas present. And
let's go for it.
I'll let you get on with your work, and thank you very much for your time.
It's been my pleasure, Andy. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little grass. Meditative gamma state full on meta. You can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. And I helped out my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what to do because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think I be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jay? But if we're being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes.